Hello, everyone. Welcome back to TESL Ontario's YouTube channel. Today on the Perspective series, we will be talking about teachers' struggles to teach pronunciation. Whether it be an issue of time constraints in a jam-packed curriculum, or perhaps a teacher's lack of familiarity with the concept itself, I believe that pronunciation is the most often forgotten skill in the ESL classroom. So in this video, we will be discussing some of the common complaints or common concerns that teachers have about teaching pronunciation and some tips on how to overcome them. I will be joined with two wonderful educators, Paramita Dutta and Urquhart, and let's get into the video. So welcome, Lewis and Paramita. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Likewise.
Yes, so basically, that's a very interesting question because, for me as a non-native speaker, but when we think of English as an international language of education, and as, we think of English more as denationalized because like it's spoken all over the world. We obviously use terms like world English, global English, and English as lingua franca, and as the link language. And at that point, like when we think of even the countries where English is the first language, like UK, USA, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, there are so many dialects, right? I mean, even English itself, like in England, the RP or the received pronunciation is only spoken by, I think, around 3%. And there are so many accents. So, and even in America, like in Canada too, like English spoken in Ontario would be different from that in Alberta. So in that sense, I think speaking about accent nowadays, it doesn't really have much sense to me as an English educator, and it's a part of your identity. I think it's a part of where you're from, and it's not something I think I would aspire to change. But yes, I think teaching pronunciation of words, the correct pronunciations of consonants and vowels is more important than aiming for an accent reduction or an accent change in the present scenario. That's my thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some great points. So let's ask Lewis, who's actually from the UK, but doesn't have an RP pronunciation. Lou?
Yeah, maybe I can draw a contrast. I mean, yes, I am a native speaker of English, but my pronunciation isn't reflective of RP at all, really, because I'm from Scotland. From my experience, a lot of the books do focus on RP. And what I like to do in this case is I just teach my own version of whatever word it might be, because you can sort of point differences out to your students between things which are intrinsically part of your dialect and things that they might hear in different parts of the UK or indeed around the world if we're going on to like global English, as you were mentioning, Paramita.
Yeah, absolutely. And like from my own personal experience, I'm a Canadian native speaker. Teaching in Canada, students kind of ask me for this model of pronunciation, but I always have to highlight that it's not the model of pronunciation here in Toronto, at least. So a thing that often comes up in this discussion is the sense of prioritizing intelligibility.
So what I understand from this expression would be the sort of transition away from having a full command of individual sounds and so on, and instead saying, you know what, it's okay if a learner, for example, struggles with certain sounds. For instance, your dental fricatives, or it's okay for a learner not to have control of their weak forms because their L1s might not be stress timed like English is. They might be syllable timed, right? So moving away from this idea that everything has to be perfect and on towards something that is more of the, if the message can be understood, it's okay variety.
Yes, I think when I definitely agree with Lewis, and I would say that when I talk about prioritizing intelligibility, I would also like to focus on prioritizing mutual intelligibility. And by that, I mean, because often when we are speaking or pronouncing, so we are, expecting like the whole onus of intelligibility to lie on the speaker. But I think it
Yeah.
also lies a lot on the listener too. And if he or she has any prejudices towards the speaker because he or she is not of the same doesn't have the same L1 and so is an L2 speaker, or maybe an immigrant. So you have some kind of prejudice and you are immediately thinking, I won't understand. And
Yeah.
so then the communication breakdown happens. So obviously pronunciation is important, because if you cannot pronounce the words correctly, then there is going to be a loss of communication. But when I say intelligibility, when I talk about this, not only pronunciation but also this intercultural communicative competence, where if I understand what the person is saying and I can make out what that person is saying irrespective of that person's accent and pronunciation, and the communication is happening, that is more important ultimately. That's what
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely. And I think that that mutual intelligibility that you mentioned is so important because it's almost like a double-edged sword. It comes
Yes,
with these prejudices that people can experience in the classroom. But at the same time, like when you're teaching in multilingual classrooms, it's actually a strength because you expose students to all of these global Englishes in your
exactly.
classroom.
And this is something I faced in my classroom too, because at one
Yeah.
point in the last course I was teaching, I had students from 15 countries
Wow.
in one classroom, and I had 21 students and 15 countries represented. And when I had discussions, they were so happy that they were listening to so many people with different accents. They
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
wonderful.
I think it might seem overwhelming if you have to like, for me, I would say I don't find it overwhelming, but then I do find it might be a challenge often teaching it online, when you're often not
Yeah.
able to show exactly from where you're producing the sound, and and be able to kind of explain the musculature. Like, it's not very easy online with this little gallery view or speaker view with a little box. It's not often, it would be more comfortable if it was face to face, right? So that can be there. And I think there are often lack of resources that because if you want to teach pronunciation, you would have to do actually a lot of research on that.
Yeah.
Yes, so look up a lot of books. They may not be readily available resources for you. So that might be there. And so I think that might be one of the reasons. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that you brought up the online nature, I mean, we're doing this like video online as well.
Yes.
But teaching online pronunciation for me was a particular struggle this year. And my students saw a lot of like
Yes.
close-ups of my mouth and just getting them to put their hands on their throat and me like over exaggerating like right in the camera. Like it was kind of like embarrassing, but I think it might have helped them because in real life you can't get that close to a person's face.
So I absolutely agree that resources are quite scarce when it comes
Yeah.
to phonology in general. I find that it's one of the most underrepresented skills in course books. In terms of finding lesson plans and doing your own research in order to find something that you want to do, I would sort of err away from that and go more towards incorporating pronunciation, like short parts of pronunciation into your lesson, rather than
Yeah.
looking for like a full lesson on pronunciation in itself. But yeah, I do agree that for that to happen, you need to sort of do your own work and not rely on materials which are already readily available.
So how would you, or what would you recommend to a teacher who wants to familiarize themselves better then with pronunciation, different sounds and features of connected speech and things like that, Lewis?
So I think the first part needs to come down to the teacher himself or herself. I mean, if you think back to when you started teaching for the first time and you had to teach a difficult grammar point for the first time, and you didn't really understand it yourself, you probably took a lot of time to yourself to sort of teach yourself that grammar point. And the same point applies to pronunciation. You have to take the time to learn IPA. It could be through watching videos on YouTube, for example. It could be some publications which focus on teaching English pronunciation, and gradually build yourself up to the point where you maybe start practice writing an IPA, start looking at texts, so authentic texts or semi-authentic or whatever, with an eye to potential pronunciation issues they could throw up. I think you have to just be alive to the idea of teaching pronunciation more as you accumulate familiarity with it.
Absolutely. And I love your idea of using authentic texts to find this, because students find it the most motivating. So songs is something that's great. There's so much connected speech in songs, like elision and all of that, that you can highlight to the students and really kind of not do a full lesson on, but if you're introducing something through a song, focus on that feature in your lesson.
And to just add, I would say that you can also, attend these different professional development, webinars or conferences. Like even in the TOSCON, I attended the one on pronunciation. And
as did I.
yes, so there was a lot to learn, a lot to take away from that. And at the same time, do your own research, do your own, build your own skills, as Lewis was saying, and talk to other educators and see what they are doing. Because I think like teaching, I mean, if you can collaborate with people or even talk to them and find out what they are doing, you just get some ideas, not that you will use all of them, but then it expands your horizon, right? So I think that's important. So I don't usually I didn't teach any pronunciation workshop or a full-length pronunciation lesson ever, but I taught it incidentally as it came up.
Yeah.
Okay. And one thing that I like, for example, to follow up with that. So like some of my Spanish speakers, like they often, because in Spanish, what happens is that the vowels, there are only 5 vowel sounds, right?
Yeah.
And so they often like just the other day, one of my students said culture instead of culture. Okay, so then I can just talk about, the short vowels and the long vowels, and then I just explain. And then so that it's not, and one advantage that I have is that I do teach a higher intermediate to advanced level students. So they have this basic grasp over pronunciation. So I do not actually need to teach them the basics. So that's one thing. But then, so when these things come up incidentally, because it's a part of the repertoire of the language they have, the inventory of language they have and the sounds they have, and that interferes with English. So instead of saying culture, they're saying culture, or, and also I teach as warm-up activities. Like I might play just a warm-up game, like for the short vowels and the long vowels, like the telephone game. Okay, so I just do these little things which they find interesting. And they like, sometimes I do tongue twisters and, just, or even minimal pairs. So like these kind of things as warm-ups, so which they find interesting.
So I sort of have a combination of Paramita's experience, and in the sense that I also teach phonology incidentally. And I think that ties back to what we were saying earlier about once you have accumulated that familiarity, just being more alive to opportunities that your learners produce and use that to reinforce pronunciation. That said, I have focused on pronunciation more explicitly at both beginner and advanced level. I have done in the past like pretty much a full hour on like introduction to IPA and so on with beginners. And it was a little bit difficult the first 10 or 15 minutes trying to get them to see the sort of usefulness of that. But when you get into things like, as Paramita was saying, when you get into like minimal pairs, they suddenly say, okay, I understand why we're doing this, because I need to know how to make a long vowel, how to make a short vowel, and what the differences can be in terms of the meaning that I put across. Once you do that, if you introduce them to IPA from a beginner level onwards, because you often see it in their course books anyway, you can start to bring in transcription more often into the classroom, so you can mark the pronunciation on the boards of new lexis that they encounter.
I think that's great, Lewis. It kind of sets your students up for success in the future. It gives them that foundation that they can always look back and kind of be more autonomous in their future studies. I mean, you're not going to be their teacher forever, right? So it's important to kind of set them up with those skills that when they read a new word, if they search it in an online dictionary, they can actually read the phonetic transcription and understand how it's pronounced. Thank you both for your insight on this topic. That was great discussion.
Thank
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Paramita and Lewis again for their wonderful insights on this discussion. And now I want to hear from you. How, if at all, do you incorporate pronunciation in your classrooms? And what are your concerns about the subject? Let us know in the comments below. See you in the next video.